Brittney Griner.
Brittney Griner.
Being detained in Moscow as tensions ratchet up between Russia and the U.S. over the invasion of Ukraine.
On February 17, 2022, Russian authorities arrested American WNBA star Brittney Griner for possession of under a gram of marijuana. This was not to last, as in the heavily controversial December 2022 deal, Russia released Griner in exchange for the notorious Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout. The case is far from unique. It's one among hundreds. Though an exact definition of the term is hard to nail down, for the purposes of this documentary, a hostage will be anyone that the United States government classifies as unlawfully detained. In this sense, a political hostage is anyone detained by a state or state-like entity for any of the above reasons, especially if they're arrested to extract concessions from another government. Hostage-taking in various forms has been a diplomatic issue for thousands of years, from the early Romans to Arab empires to late 18th century Barbary pirates. But it has only become more important in recent history, in cases like the U-2 spy plane incident or the Iran hostage crisis. Due to new evidence and developments, the Iran hostage crisis is of particular relation to this documentary's core ideas. Although addressing hostage diplomacy is a necessary facet of a state's responsibilities towards its citizens, policymakers only began to fight the issue in 2015. Until then, political hostage-taking was a neglected and untouched frontier within diplomacy. But examining the 1967 Sino-British hostage crisis and the case of Bowe Bergdahl allude to something dark. That hostage diplomacy is a process regularly hijacked by political partisans in a self-interested quest for political capital. With the onset of the War on Terror in October of 2001, hostage diplomacy once again peaked in importance. Soon after the invasion, Pakistani officials and turncoat Taliban alike arrested and turned over many senior Taliban officials to American forces. From there, many were transferred to the new facility in Guantanamo Bay. But this wasn't a one-way street. Americans were also taken prisoner, including perhaps the most infamous, the 2009 case of Private Bowe Bergdahl.
Please bring us home so that we can be back where we belong and not over here.
4 years later, President Barack Obama, fresh off a strong re-election campaign and supported by a friendly Senate, made waves in the State of the Union address by announcing a full withdrawal from Afghanistan by the end of 2014.
By the end of next year, our war in Afghanistan will be over.
But impeding the withdrawal was now Sergeant Bowe Bergdahl, still detained by the Taliban 4 years later. As far back as 2011, congressmen had made impassioned calls for the release of Bowe Bergdahl.
British papers talked about PFC Bowe Bergdahl. You know, the warrior ethos says we never leave a man behind. We will never leave a man behind. That we will do everything within our power to make sure that we get these kids back home.
Although he mispronounced Bowe's name and addressed him by the wrong title, other politicians also gave attention to the issue, including the likes of Kelly Ayotte. I want to ensure we are doing everything we can to obtain his release. Eventually, at least 12 politicians would call for the release of Bowe Bergdahl, often by any means necessary. On May 31st, 2014, independently of Congress, the Obama administration brokered a deal. The United States released 5 Taliban senior officials from Guantanamo Bay. The Taliban released Bowe Bergdahl. Despite prior support for a trade, swaths of politicians came out in opposition to the deal.
But the exchange of 5 hardest of the hardcore Al-Qaeda/Taliban will pose a threat to the United States of America.
I'm not satisfied.
And I remain increasingly convinced that the president has now set a precedent.
They cite a medley of reasons, the first of which was a violation of Section 1035 of the National Defense Authorization Act. The opposition alleged that the administration didn't notify Congress of the transfer of 5 Taliban or take appropriate measures to mitigate future risk. Though appropriate measures is a question of subjectivity, the administration violated the act by failing to notify Congress. But some people believe that the Republicans wrote the sections of the act to sabotage the Obama administration. Frank Goldsmith, who represented Harula Harikwa of the Taliban 5, is one of those people.
It never imposed any kind of restrictions like that on Bush, and so it was a purely political stunt. There were conditions impossible to fulfill, that somehow the Obama administration had to promise he was not going to engage in any attacks against the United States. Sort of a metaphysical impossibility for somebody to promise that.
Many brought up the point that Bergdahl was a deserter. National Security Advisor Susan Rice further agitated this point when she emphasized Bergdahl's capture on the battlefield and praised him for his honor and distinction.
He was an American prisoner of war, captured on the battlefield.
He had deserted, had left his post. Is that going to be investigated?
The point is that he's back. He's going to be safely reunited with his family. He served the United States with honor and distinction.
Many, like Senator Marco Rubio, argued that it set a bad precedence and could encourage further unlawful arrests. In our interview, former Deputy Secretary of State Stephen Biegun commented on the issue.
Once you start ratifying this process, there's also concern that you begin to feed a desire of organizations or individuals who are looking for something from the United States government. You're actually suggesting to them the sure path to getting it is to grab an American and hold them.
I also spoke with Mickey Bergman, Executive Director and President of the Richardson Center, the premier private organization for helping unlawfully detained Americans overseas.
There's this common sense that everybody likes to say, which is absolutely inaccurate, which is every time we make a deal and we release a prisoner or we pay ransom, we increase the incentive to kidnap more. The data doesn't support it. There's absolute ambiguity between the way and the periods that cases are resolved and the number of cases that follow.
In the end, hundreds of Republicans, many of whom had called for Bergdahl's release by any means necessary, condemned the deal. This included congressmen who were previously vocal about the issue, like Senator Ayotte or Representative Richard Nugent. Only a relative handful of Democrats condemned the trade. Democrats, who prior to the trade were largely quiet, rushed to the defense of the Obama administration.
Unfortunately, though, Mr. President, opponents of President Obama have seized upon the release of an American prisoner of war, using what should be a moment of unity and celebration of our nation as a chance to play political games.
So why was the behavior of the politicians so erratic? Why did Republicans flip on the issue? And why did Democrats suddenly gain interest? Because to the politicians, it was never about the Taliban, Bergdahl's desertion, or the Soldiers' Creed. It was a political game to see who could extract the most short-term political capital from the crisis. But as the saying goes, there's truly nothing new under the sun. Even in a wholly different situation in a wholly different country, the same factors still presented themselves. 1964 Britain, the swinging 60s, a time of cultural upheaval, decolonization, and increasing liberalism. In the 1964 parliamentary elections, Harold Wilson's Labour Party won the slimmest majority in parliamentary history, leaving them on unsure footing. Meanwhile, in Mao Zedong's China, the Cultural Revolution kicked off. A major feature of the revolution was anti-imperialist, anti-Western sentiments, culminating in extreme pressure from the Chinese for the return of Hong Kong. After Britain arrested several Chinese journalists in Hong Kong for printing inflammatory newspapers, the Chinese arbitrarily detained 24 British citizens in their diplomatic tit-for-tat policy. This standoff would last until 1970. The Labour Party faced pressing domestic issues in addition to their Chinese problems. November 18, 1967, sterling devaluation crisis, where in a single day, the pound sterling suffered 15% inflation. It was imperative to the British economy the trade remained stable. With the famous Chinese tit-for-tat strategy, a British embargo would surely lead to a Chinese embargo. But the Conservatives called regularly for harsher measures. The Conservatives had the Labour Party in a catch-22. If the Labour Party imposed sanctions, the British economy would suffer and the public would blame the Labour Party. If they did nothing, they would look lazy.
Families and the supporters of the individuals view that as the government not being motivated enough, not being willing to address their urgent humanitarian need that they have.
With such a slim majority, a stiff wind, let alone an embarrassment on top of already rampant inflation, could change the outcome of an election. Like clockwork, in 1970, the Labour Party lost the election. Just as in the Bergdahl case, to the politicians it was never about the hostages. It was always about politics. Despite the rarity of reporting on it, the political response to hostage diplomacy serves as a crucial microcosm of the broader political situation. The partisanship and opportunism found in the process are endemic to broader political functions. In contemporary times, the issue has only ballooned in importance.
It's an esoteric and narrow topic, but it's one that does consume an enormous amount of attention. These are issues of national prominence.
If we take this seriously with significant and bold deterrence policies, it will never stop, but it will be brought back to manageable numbers. If we don't do that, China, Russia, Venezuela, Iran, these 4 countries hold about 60% of the political prisoners currently being held. If we take care of it and we remove them, then we're back to the average of about 20 prisoners held, which is manageable. If we don't, we might end up with more countries joining that serial offender kind of thing, and then we'll have even more people taken.